Hello. Today we'll talk about Chapter 16, the rise of sovereignty, the rise of the state. And that is something we've already talked about. We've seen it before, but in the 17th century, several states really come into prominence, particularly France and especially Great Britain. England, which is joined by Scotland and becomes Great Britain. So how does all this happen? Let me go back a little bit and just review very quickly why Europe. We talked about that last time, but why does Europe come into prominence? Because Europe really comes into prominence, and that precedes the ability of the British to really come into their own as Europe rises, if I can use that term. Why Europe? Well, a number of things have happened, and we've seen them. Europe has taken advantage of the navigation revolution, if I can call it that, the technology to support that. Europe has added several masts, a three-masted ship, the Caravel ship that we talked about last time. So Europe has really done quite well in terms of building its navigational skills, building its ability actually to sail around the world, to find other places, to dominate them, to colonialize them, and that's already beginning to happen, as we've seen in the 16th century. So you have that. Europe also is at the forefront of what becomes a commercial revolution, and that goes along, of course, with its navigational abilities, with its desire to explore. And as that happens, Europeans, particularly, of course, as we know, Portugal, to some extent at first, and then the English and then the French, all get involved in this. And what they're building is a kind of a trilateral trade system between Africa, Europe, and America, after America is discovered and begins to be developed somewhat. One reason that Europe is able to dominate, and especially England, is it can take advantage of a trilateral trade that nobody else is in position to really do as much. It takes over also some of the skills, some of the technologies, as we've seen before from the Arabs. So when you begin to add all these things up, Europe is in a very good position to expand out, to even dominate. And now several other things have to happen, and one of them clearly is the emergence of a state. And in this particular era, we're talking about the emergence of national monarchies. And as that happens, states become consolidated, states become more powerful. The royals, the kings, the queens, the monarchies can actually exert control over other areas of the world outside of Europe. The problem, of course, is that if several states become powerful, they can also go to war with each other, and that can actually drag Europe down. That's going to happen. There are several things that have to also happen in order for the states to really emerge and become world powers. One of them is not only the consolidation of the state itself, but you have to have a dynastic settlement. It has to be certain, it has to be clear who shall rule. And in this period, we're talking about ruling, not governing so much. We're talking about ruling. Who shall rule? England is going to be very good at establishing succession. It doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen quickly. You may know the Wars of the Roses, which go on for some time, culminating finally in the victory of Henry VII, and that's in 1485. He's the father of Henry VIII. So the monarchy is going to be somewhat consolidated in England fairly early on, and that's going to play a major role in the ability of England to sort of dominate as well. The French also will consolidate their monarchy, and they will emerge with it. Finally, it takes some time. In 1589, Henry IV, after a series of assassinations, different families quarreling with each other, Henry IV becomes the king of France, but he's assassinated also in 1610, and France goes into a long period of kind of going up and down until finally Louis XIV, later in the century, is able to exert control and able to establish a national monarchy there. So you might say, why am I talking about France? I'm not talking about England. Well, the French under Louis XIV will, in fact, be very powerful, but they make one big mistake, and that is Louis XIV is very ambitious. He's able to control the aristocracy fairly well. He simply puts them off into the Palace of Versailles, gives them all sorts of silly things to do, and they wander around taking care of his toilet, but they don't seem to do much of anything else. But the real problem is that he goes to war with continental powers, and the reason for that, of course, Henry is a land. He's the end of Louis XIV. Louis is a king of a country which is a land power, and that's going to mean that it has to share borders with other countries, and then that simply means that Louis is going to be involved in almost endless wars, which he will be, between coming to power in 1661 almost all the way up to the end of 1714, quarreling, for example, who shall be the king of Spain, et cetera, et cetera. Why the rise of England, then? Why does England become the preeminent power? It's able to take advantage of a number of things that Europeans generally were doing. One of them, the commercial revolution that I already mentioned. Another is, as the state consolidates, this is especially true for England, the policy of mercantilism. That's where you deliberately protect your industry, where you protect it, erect tariff walls around your industry, subsidize it, and of course the English will be doing exactly that. So you have, that's very important in terms of developing its industry. It's already developed its commercial abilities, its navigational abilities, so you have all those things in place. What you don't have in place, of course, is a final sort of a constitutional settlement. Let me take a look at that. If you go back in English history, several things have happened that are extremely important. Take the year 1066. 1066, as we know, the conquest of England, right? The Duke of Normandy conquers, William of Normandy conquers the English, 1066. That's really important for the simple reason that England is immediately consolidated under one power, under one king. And that, of course, inaugurates the sort of relative stability of the monarchy from that point on. And the other thing that's really important is England is an island, very difficult to conquer it. It was almost never conquered except by William himself in 1066. Much later on, as we know, even Hitler was not able to conquer England, though he certainly tried in the summer of 1940. So England being an island, that gives it a number of advantages. It doesn't share a border with any other power, so it's going to get into fewer land wars. As a naval power, it's positioned perfectly in order to go to America, in order to really to sail the seas. And so it has distinct advantages there as well. 1215, another important date. In 1215, the king, King John, in order to raise funds to conduct war, once again, in order to conduct funds, he has to grant the Great Charter to the English nobility. Charter simply means that they will consent. It's not a constitution, but it is sort of a constitutional foundation. The nobility will consent. They must give their consent to raise taxes. And if the king goes to them, asks for their consent, and they give it, then he will have the right to raise taxes for the purpose of raising an army. That's very important. That establishes the principle, for the first time really, of no taxation without representation. It might sound like a small thing to us, we take that for granted. It was not something to take for granted at all. Nobles did not want to be taxed. They would rebel quite often against the king. So here you have the regularization of that. Go up to 1300. 1300, this principle is extended even further with the establishment more or less of a parliament or something like a parliament, and that is where men of wealth and men of land and land nobility, they meet in session with the king for consultation. They do not yet have the power to make laws, but they are to be consulted. They are to be consulted. So men of wealth, men of power, the landed nobility will be consulted in Parliament, in session. Again, they're not making laws, but they are, again, giving their consent for the raising of taxation once again, and also matters of state, matters of policy. So it's very important. Very important. It establishes the foundation of a kind of a constitutional system. You know, the English were very big about this always, and if you talk to people now, they say that England is about liberty. It's about defending the individual right. It's about defending the individual right against the power of the state. That becomes extremely important as you march further into English history. By contrast, look at what's happening in France in this period, in the 17th century now. In France, you have the tremendous expansion of royal power, but to some extent, it's at the expense of everybody else. Too much power in the center, not enough liberty. Guess what's going to come out of that? The French Revolution. That's later down the road. So what are the other things that happened in the 17th century that make England really great? Well, for one thing, it has a kind of, I would call it a dynastic settlement in 1603, when the reigns of the Tudors come to an end without a successor to Elizabeth, and James I becomes the King of England. He's the first Stuart, and this is going to be a family which will control, which will dominate, which will be the royals, the royal family, all the way until 1714 and the death of Queen Anne. So you have a sort of dynastic settlement at this point. It's very important. James, by the way, was also James VI. He was the King of Scotland before he became the King of England. So when he becomes the King of England, he brings these two realms together. He was the son, by the way, of Mary, the Queen of Scots. So you have the king, James I. Now you also have Parliament, and in the 17th century they're going to have tremendous differences, because the king, James I, was actually, he regarded himself as a king of royal absolutism was his principle, and in fact he even wrote something called the True Law of Divine Right Monarchy, the True Law of Divine Right Monarchy, in which he asserts the rights of the monarchy to be absolute. That goes against everything that we've seen and we just talked about preceding it. That is to say, the rights of Parliament to be consulted, the rights of Parliament to grant its consent for taxation. In fact, down the road just a little bit, there is a conflict, in fact, between James and the Parliament, and it becomes even worse with his successor, Charles I. It's over matters of taxation once again. Predominantly, it's over who has the right to raise an army. Does the king have the right to raise an army and to demand taxes in order to raise it? In 1629, the next king, Charles the First, he actually suspends the Parliament. He imposes taxation on England. A number of members of Parliament refused the taxation. They are arbitrarily arrested by the king, and you have more or less a stalemate all the way until 1640, when the Great Revolution starts. And of course, that's Oliver Cromwell, that's the Cromwellian army, that's many people in England rising against the king, including many members of Parliament, including the support of many of the commoners throughout England, particularly those landed, those who want land. And you might say England between 1640 and 1660 is something of a mess. In fact, the revolution gets quite messy. It becomes almost a real revolution. The masses of England rise up. Some of them even sound like early day communists. They want the redistribution of lands to those who are landless. And so finally, the powers that be, the nobility, the royal family, decide perhaps England needs to step back a bit and needs to restore the crown. In fact, that's exactly what happens in 1660. Charles II, also a Stuart, comes to the throne now, and he'll be on the throne between 1660 and 1685. A number of changes are brought about, but obviously it's not going to be a final settlement. One important act passes while he's king in 1673. It's called the Test Act. And the Test Act essentially says that no Catholic can come to the throne. So there will not be a Catholic. Remember that the English have become Anglicans. They've established their own Protestant church, particularly starting with Queen Elizabeth I. So that act is passed in 1673. 1685, James II comes to the throne. James II, as you may know, was a Catholic. In 1688, he actually baptizes his son Catholic, and he revokes the Test Act. Doing that sounds an alarm to many in England, particularly those who were actually you might say the beneficiaries of the earlier religious settlements, which had actually allowed them to transfer considerable property to themselves. I won't get into all that now, but the point is that James II has literally declared war on his own parliament and on his own nobility. And that's what's going to chase him from the throne. He will leave, and his oldest daughter, Mary, will come to the throne along with her husband, William, who happens to be the stadtholder of the Netherlands, but that's another story we won't get into. William and Mary come to the throne, but what it means really is the Stuarts remain, and they will. Now, 1688, 1689 is the great, it's called the Great Revolution, it's the Great Settlement, you might say, but it establishes what really had been the aim of the parliamentary majority for some time, of the nobility for some time, of many in England, and that was to say that the throne, the crown, the royal family would now be on a new basis. It would no longer be absolute. It would not be thought of as royal absolutism at all. The new basis is actually a contract. It's a contract between the king and his people. Should the king violate that contract, then the revolution is legitimized. And here's the things that change now. No taxation without representation. Parliament cannot be arbitrarily suspended. Habeas corpus, something that we know in this country, which means that nobody can be arbitrarily arrested and kept under arrest without representation, without cause. And so essentially, it's a very democratic, or at least liberal revolution. Parliament can't be suspended. It must be called into session. These are all changes. The king is put now permanently on a civil list. That is to say that the king is put on a salary, which is to be determined by the parliament. So there's all sorts of kind of liberal changes which have happened now. The royal courts cannot be supreme as they had been before. Now individuals are entitled to a trial by jury. So you've got what it amounts to is independent judiciary. What it amounts to is the determination of royal succession. What it amounts to is limits on the king. What we're talking about now is not royal absolutism, but constitutional republic. It's a settlement that's extremely important because it's a dynastic settlement. In 1689, the Act of Toleration is passed. That means also a religious settlement because non-Anglicans now achieve full rights. Supposedly they can't get into office, but actually that's not entirely true. So the Act of Toleration is extremely important. It means a religious settlement to go with the dynastic settlement. And then finally, the Act of Settlement in 1701, which says that no Catholic can come to the throne. That more or less seals the bargain. That completes the revolution. It's not a revolution in the same sense of the French Revolution in 1789. It's a peaceful revolution, a bloodless revolution, and it establishes essentially the stability for England. It establishes and regularizes the relationships between Parliament and King, between Parliament and the royal family. And the result is that much greater stability in England, much greater political settlement in England than virtually anywhere else that you look. And it allows England, you might say, to sort of organize itself, go forward, not a full democracy, but certainly a liberal country protecting the liberties of Englishmen. And that's it for today.